You know what? I think for the rest of this book, I mean, it's okay, but it's kind of just goes on and on. And I think instead of, I mean, I'm gonna read it, but I think it would be funner if I talk to you as well. So, because I'm reading this book and, there's something I want to mention or say, and I feel like I can't because I'm reading and I have to just read. But, hey, this is my channel. I can do whatever I want. So, let's read this book and enjoy it. Isabel was married to Gray Machen early in the June of the year after the termination of her engagement to Larry. Though Elliot hated leaving Paris at a moment when the season was at its height and he must miss a number of grand parties, his family feeling was too strong to allow him to neglect what he thought a social duty. Isabel's brothers were unable to leave their distant posts, and so it behooved him to make the irksome journey to Chicago to give his niece away. Behooved. That would be a fun word to start using. I need to remember to use that more often. Remembering that French aristocrats, I cannot say that right, aristocrats. Remembering that French aristocrats had gone to the guillotine in all their finery, he made a special journey to London to get himself a new morning coat, a dove-gray, double-breasted waistcoat, and a silk hat. On his return to Paris, he invited me to come and see them on. He was in a state of perturbation, because the gray pearl he usually wore on his necktie would not make any sort of effect against the pale gray tie he had chosen as suitable to the festive occasion. I suggested his emerald and diamond pin. If I were a guest, yes, he said, but in the particular position I shall occupy, I feel that a pearl is indicated. He was much pleased with the marriage, which concorded with all his ideas of propriety, and he spoke of it with the, I cannot say this word, unctuousness, unctuousness, unctuous, smug, self-serving. I need to look that word up. He spoke of it with the unctuousness of a dowager duchess expressing herself on the suitability of a union between a scion of the La Rochefoucalds with the daughter of the Montmorency. As a visible mark of his satisfaction, he was taking over as a wedding present, sparing no expense, a fine portrait by Natir of a princess of the House of France. It appeared that Henry Maturin had bought for the young couple a house in Astor Street so that they should be close to where Miss Bradley lived and not too far from his own palatial residence on Lakeshore Drive. By a happy chance, in which I suspected the deft complacency of Elliot, Gregory Brabazon was in Chicago at the time. The purchase was made and the decoration was entrusted to him. When Elliot returned to Europe and, throwing in his hand so far as the season in Paris was concerned, came straight to London, he brought photographs of the result. Gregory Brabazon had let himself go. In the drawing room he had gone all George II, and it was very grand. In the library, which was to be Gray's den, he had been inspired by a room in the Amalienburg Palace at Munich, and except that there was no place for books, it was perfect. Save for the twin beds, Louis Quince visiting Madame de Pompadour would have found himself perfectly at home in the bedroom. Gregory had provided for his young American couple, but Isabel's bathroom would have been an eye-opener to him. It was all glass, wall, ceiling, and bath, and on the walls silverfish meandered profusely among gilded aquatic plants. "Of course, it's a tiny house," said Elliot, but Henry told me the decorations set him back $100,000, a fortune to some people. The ceremony was performed with such pomp an Episcopalian church could afford. Not like a wedding at Notre Dame, he told me complacently, but for a Protestant affair, it didn't lack style. The press had behaved very handsomely, and Elliot negligently tossed the cuttings to me. He showed me photographs of Isabel, hefty but handsome in her wedding dress and gray, a massive but fine figure of a man, a trifle self-conscious in his formal clothes. There was a group of young couple with bridesmaids, and another group with Miss Bradley in a sumptuous garment, and Elliot holding his new top hat with a grace that only he could have achieved. I asked how Miss Bradley was. "She's lost a good deal of weight, and I don't like her color, but she's pretty well. Of course, the whole thing was a strain on her, but now it's all over, she'll be able to rest up." A year later, Isabel was delivered of a daughter to whom, following the fashion of the moment, she gave the name Joan. And after an interval of 2 years, she had another daughter whom, following another fashion, she called Priscilla. One of Henry Matron's partners died, and the other two, under pressure, soon afterwards retired, so that he entered into sole possession of the business over which he had always exercised despotic control. He realized the ambition he had long entertained and took Gray into partnership with him. The firm had never been so prosperous. "They're making money hand over fist, my dear fellow," Elliot told me. "Why, Gray, at the age of 25, is making $50,000 a year, and that's only a beginning. The resources of America are inexhaustible. It isn't a boom. It's just the natural development of a great country." His chest swelled with unwonted patriotic fervor. "Henry Matron can't live forever. High blood pressure, you know, and by the time Gray's 40, he should be worth $20 million. Princely, my dear fellow, princely." Elliot kept up a fairly regular correspondence with his sister, and from time to time, as the years went on, passed on to me what she told him. Gray and Isabel were very happy, and the babies were sweet. They lived in a style that Elliot gladly admitted was eminently suitable. They entertained lavishly and were lavishly entertained. He told me with satisfaction that Isabel and Gray hadn't dined by themselves once in 3 months. Their whirl of gaiety was interrupted by the death of Miss Matron, that colorless, high-born lady whom Henry Matron had married for her connections when he was making a place for himself in the city to which his father had come as a country bumpkin, and out of respect for her memory, for a year the young couple never entertained more than 6 people to dinner. "Sorry, this year we can only have 6 of you come over at a time." Imagine having that many parties. That would be exhausting. "I've always said that 8 was the perfect number," said Elliot, determined to look on the bright side of things. "It's intimate enough to permit a general conversation, and yet large enough to give the impression of a party." Gray was wonderfully generous to his wife. On the birth of their first child, he gave her a square-cut diamond ring, and on the birth of her second, a sable coat. He was too busy to leave Chicago much, but such holidays as he could take they spent at Henry Matron's imposing house at the Maugham. Henry could deny nothing to his son, whom he adored, and one Christmas gave him a plantation in South Carolina so that he could get a fortnight's duck shooting in the season. Of course, our merchant princess correspond to those great patrons of the art of the Italian Renaissance who made fortunes by commerce. The Medici, for instance. 2 kings of France were not too proud to marry the daughters of that illustrious family, and I foresee the day when the crowned heads of Europe will seek the hands of our dollar princesses. What was it Shelley said? The world's great age begins anew, the golden years return. Henry Matron had, for many years, looked after Miss Bradley's and Elliot's investments, and they had a well-justified confidence in his acumen. He had never countenanced speculation and had put their money into sound securities. But with the great increase in values, they found their comparatively modest fortunes increased in a manner that both surprised and delighted him. Elliot told me that without stirring a finger, he was nearly twice as rich in 1926 as he had been in 1918. He was 65. His hair was gray, his face lined, and there were pouches under his eyes, but he bore his years gallantly. He was slim and held himself as erectly as ever. He had always been moderate in his habits and taken care of his appearance. He had no intention of submitting to the ravages of time, so long as he could have his clothes made by the best tailor in London, his hair dressed and his face shaved by his own particular barber, and a monsieur to come in every morning to keep his elegant body in perfect condition. He had long forgotten that he had ever so far demeaned himself as to engage in a trade. And without ever saying so outright, for he was not so stupid to tell a lie that might be found out, he was inclined to suggest that in his youth he had been in the diplomatic service. I must admit that if I had ever had an occasion to draw a portrait of an ambassador, I should without hesitation have chosen Elliot as my model. But things were changing. Such of the great ladies who had advanced Elliot's career as were still alive were well along in years. The English peeresses, having lost their lords and had been forced to surrender their mansions to daughters-in-law, and had retired to villas at Cheltenham or to modest houses in Regent's Park. Stafford House was turned into a museum. Curzon House became the seat of an organization. Devonshire House was for sale. The yacht on which Elliot had been in the habit of staying at Cowes had passed on to other hands. The fashionable persons who occupied the stage had no use for the elderly man that Elliot now was. They found him tiresome and ridiculous. They were still willing to come to his elaborate luncheon parties at Claridge's, but he was quick-witted enough to know that they came to meet one another rather than to see him. He could no longer pick and choose among the invitations that once had littered his writing table, and much more often than he would have liked anyone to know, he suffered the humiliation of dining by himself in the privacy of his suite. Women of rank in England, when a scandal had closed the doors of society to them, develop an interest in the arts and surround themselves with painters, writers, and musicians. Elliot was too proud thus to humiliate himself. The death duties and the war profiteers have ruined English society, he told me. People don't seem to mind who they know. London still has its tailors, its bootmakers, and its hatters, and I Trust they'll last my time, but except for them it's finished. My dear fellow, do you know that St. Earths have women to wait at tables? This, he said, when we were walking away from Carrollton House Terrace after a luncheon party at which an unfortunate incident had occurred. Our noble host had a well-known collection of pictures, and a young American who was there, Paul Barton by name, expressed a desire to see them. You've got a Titan, haven't you? We had. It's in America now. Some old Jew offered us a packet of money for it, and we were damned hard up at the time, so my governor sold it. I noticed that Elliot bristling threw a venomous glance at the jovial Marquess and guessed that it was he who had bought the picture. He was furious at hearing himself, Virginian born and the descendant of signatory of the Declaration thus described. He had never in his life suffered so great an affront, and what made it worse was that Paul Barton was the object of his virulent hatred. He was a young man who had appeared in London soon after the war. He was 23, blond, very good-looking, charming, a beautiful dancer, and had an ample fortune. He had brought a letter of introduction to Elliot, who, with the kindness of his heart, natural to him, had presented him to several of his friends. Not content with this, he had given him some valuable hints on conduct. Delving back into his own experience, he had shown him how it was possible by paying small attention to old ladies and by lending a willing ear to distinguished men, however tedious for a stranger to make his way in society. But it was a different world that Paul Barton entered from that into which a generation before Elliot Templeton had penetrated by means of dogged perseverance. It was a world bent on amusing itself. Paul Barton's high spirits, pleasing exterior, and engaging manner did for him in a few weeks what Elliot had achieved only after years of industry and determination. Soon he had no longer needed Elliot's help and took small pains to conceal the fact. He was pleasant to him when they met, but in an offhand way that deeply offended the older man. Elliot did not ask people to a party because he liked them, but because they helped him make it go. And since Paul Barton was popular, he continued to invite him on occasion to his weekly luncheons. But the successful young man was generally engaged, and twice he threw Elliot over at the last moment. Elliot had done this himself too often not to know was because he had a more tempting invitation. I don't ask you to believe it, Elliot told me, fuming, but it's God's truth that when I see him now, he patronizes me. Me! Titan, he spluttered. He wouldn't know a Titan if he saw one. I had never seen Elliot so angry, and I guessed his wrath was caused by his belief that Paul Barton had asked about the picture maliciously, having somehow learned that Elliot had bought it and would make a funny story at his expense out of the noble lord's reply. He's nothing but a dirty little snob, and if there's one thing in the world I detest and despise, it's snobbishness. So were they calling Elliot? It's in America now. Some old Jew offered us a packet of money for it, and we were damned hard up at the time, so my governor sold it. So Elliot's mad because he bought the painting, I guess, and this guy that sold it is saying it's in America. and and he's making fun of Elliot for buying the painting. I need to look up and see what a Titian is. I'll post a picture for you at the end if I can. He's nothing but a dirty little snob, and if there's one thing in the world I detest and despise, it's snobbishness. He'd have been nowhere except for me. Would you believe it? His father makes office furniture. Office furniture. He put withering scorn into the two words, and when I tell people he simply doesn't exist in America, his origins couldn't be more humble. They don't seem to care. Take my word for it, my dear fellow, English society is as dead as the dodo. Nor did Eliot find France much better. There was great ladies of his youth, if still alive, were given over to bridge, a game he loathed, piety and the care of his grandchildren, manufacturers, Argentines, Chileans, American women, separated or divorced from their husbands, inhabited the stately houses of their aristocracy and entertained with splendor, but at their parties Eliot was confounded to meet politicians who spoke French with a vulgar accent, journalists whose table manners were deplorable, and even actors. The scions of princely families, thought it no shame to marry the daughters of shopkeepers. It was true, Paris was gay, but with what a shoddy gaiety. The young, devoted to the mad pursuit of pleasure, thought nothing more amusing than to go from one stuffy little nightclub to another, drinking champagne at the 100 francs a bottle and dancing close packed with the riffraff of the town till 5 o'clock in the morning. The smoke, the heat, the noise made Eliot's head ache. This was not the Paris he had accepted 30 years before at his spiritual home. This was not the Paris that good Americans went to when they died. I've never been to Paris, but when he talks about these nightclubs back years ago, there was quite a few of them. I don't even know if they exist anymore, but that was fun. I mean, that noise so loud, that music, and everybody's just, you hear that beat. Those were some fun days. Yep. There's this place in Memphis called the Red Square, and there was another place, I believe it was called 616. I had no idea where they even were in Memphis, but that was 20 years ago. More than that. But that was some fun times. Well, let me look up that Titian for you and see what that's about. So it looks like this Titian, or Titian, however you say it, is that's like an American name they gave to this French painter. He has a different name, but it looks like he's one of those really famous painters that you've seen pictures of, pictures that he's painted. This one is one that, it's funny, when I saw this I was like, that's who painted that. That's a picture that sticks out in my mind a lot. But these are a couple of the paintings that he did. You'll recognize them. And then here's the picture that he gave Isabel. at her wedding, Isabel and Gray, when they got married. This is the painting that he gave to them. Well, this is a lot more fun reading this way, so hope you can still enjoy the story, and we'll see you tomorrow. Take care, bye-bye.